I would like to begin with a day, an ordinary day that captured everything one needs to understand about this war. In the morning, the world woke up to the headline. The American president lifts the blockade. It sounded like peace. People opened the statement and read the conditions. We come in, take the enriched uranium, they reopen the strait and charge no fees at all. And nobody pays anyone any money. In other words, under the cover of lifting the blockade, exactly the same deal that Iran had repeatedly rejected was being presented once again. Tehran responded within a few hours. There is no deal. And by the evening of that same day, the American Naval Command had issued a warning to mariners. Military operations had begun in the Strait of Hormuz, near the Musandam Peninsula. Ships were instructed to coordinate passage with the American side, and those suspected of laying mines could be fired upon. Think about that for a moment. A morning, the blockade is lifted. An evening, a military operation in the very same strait. Between them, only a few hours. Today, I want to analyze what lies behind this oscillation and why what happened was not just another episode of one man's unpredictability, but a symptom of something deeper, a form of power in which words have become completely detached from actual capabilities. I will start with what struck me most about this picture, and it was not the tweet itself. What struck me was the market's reaction to it, or more precisely, how little it reacted. 3 months ago, a headline such as "Blockade lifted, peace is near" would have sent oil prices crashing. Markets would have surged on expectations. This time, oil dipped briefly and recovered almost immediately. People barely finished reading the post down to the conditions. Think about what that means. The words of the leader of the world's largest economy no longer move the market the way they once did. The price has stopped believing the promise. And in my view, that is the quiet moment of a historical transition. No gunfire, no explosion, just the moment when words spoken from above simply stop having an effect. Why did this happen? The best explanation is the story of the boy who cried wolf. In the original tale, the boy managed 3 false alarms before the village stopped running to him. Here, the count has long since entered double digits. For 8 weeks, the message has sounded the same. Close, not close. Finished, not finished. Firm, flexible. We sign, we withdraw. When a position changes every hour, people stop taking it seriously, and the market was simply the first to do so. Now to why, in my assessment, there will be no deal. Here it is important to separate the superficial explanation from the real one. The superficial explanation is that one cannot negotiate with someone who makes a decision in the evening that contradicts the decision made that morning. That is true, but it is a symptom, not a cause. The cause lies deeper. It is a structural deadlock. Moods pass, a deadlock remains. I will not repeat here what we analyzed extensively in the previous program about Washington's ability to reach an agreement. Anyone who needs it can watch that analysis on the channel. I will only state the conclusion. One side's position fluctuates, while the other side's position stands like a wall. And it stands because Iranian demands have not moved from the beginning. At the start of April, Tehran presented a document, first with 10 points and later with 14, and did not retreat a single step over 2 months. Lifting sanctions, especially on oil, releasing frozen assets, ending the war in Lebanon, control over the strait and the right to charge transit fees. The nuclear issue only afterward, after sanctions relief and after Lebanon, and not as the subject of an immediate bargain. And importantly, pressure on Iran no longer works. They have moved beyond the phase in which threats could push them into a rushed agreement out of fear. According to available reports, the Iranian side made it clear that the side dictating conditions is the one that feels victorious on the field, not the one issuing ultimatums from afar. Here I must add a reservation. A demand for $300 billion in compensation was mentioned on Iranian state television, and there was also a version claiming that the American president's post had been published at the request of the Iranian side itself as part of an arrangement. Both remain unconfirmed. I classify them as rumors of the moment, not as positions at the negotiating table. And here a question arises that I consider more important than all the arguments over wording. If the Iranian position is so firm, why does Iran tolerate all of this? Why does it only respond to strikes instead of striking first? This is not weakness. In my observation, it is the most calculated approach in the entire story. As long as Iran remains in a reactive position, responding but not initiating, it retains the diplomatic high ground. It cannot be accused of confirming the Western stereotype about itself. And that stereotype is simple. It has been repeated for decades. Iran consists of ruthless fanatics who are merely waiting for a pretext to attack. Therefore, anything is permitted against them, and the moment Iran strikes first, it immediately falls into the trap that has been prepared. See, we told you so. This is exactly what we expected from them. That is why it waits. It is struck, it responds. It is struck again, it responds again. And in most cases, the response proves more painful than the blow it received. Hence the entire logic of these pinprick actions and the American approach behind them. Push into the chest, provoke, and make Iran appear to be violating the ceasefire. First, a ship is sent into the strait. Iran stops it. In response, there is a strike. Then more ships are sent. Another provocation, another warning response. And when Iran appears ready to retaliate seriously, ready to strike hard, the other side pulls back. And in that retreat lies the whole truth. It does not retreat out of generosity, but because it lacks the means for anything more. It is a finger poking someone in the chest and immediately hiding once the other person clenches a fist. And there is one aspect of this patience that is often overlooked. Iran has tied the end of the fighting not only to itself, but also to others, to the war in Lebanon and to the fate of the Palestinians. Think about how this challenges the familiar narrative. For years we were told that Iran cared only about itself and used others as pawns. But if that were true, it would have removed itself from the line of fire long ago, instead of attaching conditions related to third parties. The fact that it does the opposite suggests the opposite conclusion. And since we are discussing causes, I will also ask the most uncomfortable question. What is this war actually about? We are told it is about Iran's nuclear program. In my assessment, that is a distraction, a red herring. Consider a simple thought experiment. Imagine that Iran had no nuclear program at all. Do you believe it would have been left alone and peacefully accepted as a permanent neighbor? Hardly. The dispute over where enriched uranium should be stored, whether in Russia, China, or Pakistan, is not a dispute about the core issue, but about the stage scenery. The Iranians themselves categorically rejected the American demand to transfer the uranium to the United States and equated it with surrender, and they interpreted it correctly. This is not about uranium. It is about an old grievance that is rarely spoken aloud. Iran once had the audacity to remove a government imposed from outside by force. The country was considered someone else's possession, and its people took it back. Since then, everything possible has been done to avoid forgiving that act. Around this grievance, an entire mythology was built. Iran as a nest of religious fanatics obsessed with imposing their beliefs on the world. It is a convenient image, but it collapses when confronted with one simple fact. The very extremist movements often used to frighten people regard Iran as heretical and are themselves hostile toward it. In other words, Iran is labeled fanatical according to the same logic used by those who are actively fighting against it. The lie is enormous. It is repeated, people believe it, and a power acts accordingly, hostile because it has declared a country an enemy and cannot come to terms with the fact that it exists. Now to why this strait has become the focal point of the entire balance of power. And here, there is a detail that should be stated carefully. While people argue over words at the top, according to available data, 24 ships passed through the strait within 24 hours. The previous day there were 26, all with Iranian authorization. Iran directly stated that ships sailing without prior coordination with it would be subject to attack. In other words, on paper the blockade is lifted, but on the water passage is still coordinated with Tehran. And there is a development that says a great deal about the new geometry of the world. The relevant Iranian committee announced that Russia and China would receive preferences, special conditions, and priority passage. A flow was simply redirected to places where Washington has no leverage. Against this backdrop comes the promise to force Iran to clear mines. Here, arithmetic is merciless toward rhetoric. According to statements made by the American Department of Defense before Congress, even if the strait were completely free of threats, mine-clearing operations would take roughly half a year. Half a year. Yet this is presented as something that can be solved with a tweet. The attempt to revive the pressure strategy is essentially an effort to repeat the old freedom of navigation operation, only now without relying on former allies, and instead leaning on bases such as those in Kuwait. And the case of Oman is particularly revealing. A threat was voiced that Oman could be bombed if it obstructed passage through the strait. Oman responded publicly, "We do not fear threats of bombing or sanctions and will ensure maritime security together with Iran." Think about that. This is a country with long-standing ties to Washington and with American military personnel stationed on its territory. Yet it says openly not, "This is our sovereign territory and we alone decide," but rather, "We will decide together with Iran." That shows how narrow the circle of dependable partners has become. Even formal allies are beginning to distance themselves. Now to the most interesting issue of all. Money. Because the real bomb beneath everything is not military but economic, and it ticks more quietly than explosions. I spoke about the dollar as a weapon in the previous program, so I will not expand on it here. I will only add a new thread that has passed almost unnoticed: helium. For 3 months, roughly 44% of the global supply of this gas has disappeared from the market. It sounds insignificant, a gas used for balloons. In reality, modern microchips cannot be manufactured without helium. Taiwan's chip production, which depends on helium, has begun to decline. China's, meanwhile, has accelerated because China possesses sufficient supplies. Chip prices are rising. That means phones, computers, and all kinds of technology become more expensive. This blow to the average consumer's wallet has not fully arrived yet, but it is on its way and is expected to become noticeable within about a month. Add that to what follows from the logic of a restricted Gulf itself: recession and inflation at the same time. Exactly the combination that hits people from two directions. They lose jobs and pay more. That pressure, not threats from overseas, will become the real force pushing all sides towards some form of agreement. And there is another development that challenges the familiar picture. It is taken for granted that the United States is an oil superpower, a net exporter. But if one looks not at volume but at quality, the picture changes. Imagine the entire spectrum of alcohol, from light beer to strong liquor. The United States produces oil that, on this scale, resembles beer and inexpensive wine. But the heavy, high-grade oil from which diesel and other critically important fuels are made comes from abroad, from Canada, the Middle East, and Russia. The Middle East as a source is now uncertain, and relations with Russia are clear enough. It turns out that the very oil the country truly needs has become much less accessible. Above all of this stands a broader shift that can be seen through a simple measure. Are countries lining up to buy American government bonds, or are they selling them? They are selling them. They are buying gold instead. More and more countries are paying for oil not in dollars but in yuan. That is the most honest vote of all, the vote cast with money. And it suggests that the world has already begun to change and is not returning to the old order. Now to why the leverage of power itself has also begun to erode. Here I refer once again to the previous analysis. We already examined the issues of depleted stockpiles, Tomahawk missiles, and interceptor missiles. Anyone interested can find that discussion on the channel. What matters today is that this lesson is visible in every detail, including the situation involving drones. According to available reports, Iran has reportedly shot down around 25 American Reaper drones since the end of February. Each one is worth roughly $35 million, and the sensor package it carries is no cheaper than the platform itself. The estimated losses are approaching $2 billion. I present these figures as estimates, not as certified results. But the scale speaks for itself. Expensive and difficult to replace equipment is being neutralized by inexpensive means, and there is little available to replace it. The pattern of the strikes themselves reveals the same weakness I discussed earlier when analyzing Iranian patience. The retreats are not acts of generosity, but consequences of limited means. According to available information, the vice president is attempting to keep all of this within bounds. A man who reportedly never wanted this war. Over the past week, the tone on the American side has indeed become softer, and I tend to see this as an attempt to protect appearances. We analyzed the strike on the base in Kuwait and the measured Iranian warning that followed in the previous program. Today, I will simply note that the same model is repeating itself. Strikes are carried out just far enough to mark a boundary, and retreats follow just far enough to avoid closing off future options. Now to the Gulf, because a fracture has become visible there that previously could not be seen so clearly. According to a report published in a major business magazine, the Emirates carried out dozens of strikes against Iran during the conflict, including attacks on energy infrastructure after the ceasefire had been declared, reportedly with intelligence support from allies. If that is accurate, the Emirates reject these reports, then the reality inside the Gulf is far harsher than it appears from the outside. According to the same information, Saudi Arabia pushed for pressure to be applied to the Emirates to halt the strikes, fearing they could provoke retaliation against the region's energy infrastructure and the global oil market. The Emirati side, meanwhile, was reportedly frustrated that Saudi Arabia refused to join joint actions against Iran. Think about that. One group of allies is urging another group of allies to stop fighting, while the second group is irritated that the first did not participate in the fighting. This is not a unified bloc, it is a neighborhood dispute hidden behind a common banner. And the banner itself carries a certain irony, the so-called Gulf Cooperation Council. Ask yourself, what exactly have these countries cooperated on consistently during the last 10 years? In recent years, some have exchanged attacks with others, and before that, they maintained a blockade against a neighboring state for years and attempted to cut off its supplies. Each capital pursues only its own course, and by its own, one often means not the welfare of the country, but the personal interests of its ruler. As long as the individual at the top prospers, the fate of the state becomes secondary. Against that background, something emerges that turns the conventional picture upside down. Historically, these capitals have often had more friction with one another than with Iran. Iran does not possess a fanatical mission to impose its religious model on its neighbors. That is part of the same mythology I discussed earlier. More than that, when neighboring states attempted several years ago to economically strangle one of their own through supply restrictions, it was Iran that extended a hand and offered assistance. In other words, it demonstrated a willingness to coexist, unlike those who formerly belong to the same bloc. And now, as the American presence contracts, the Gulf faces a dual challenge, finding its own air defense solutions while simultaneously making peace with Tehran. It is also worth remembering why Iran struck targets on their territories in the first place, not out of unprovoked aggression, but in response to those territories being used as launch platforms for attacks against it. A reaction to direct involvement, not a random assault. The Emirates represent the most sensitive pressure point in this evolving situation, and this dynamic may continue to change. There is even a theory that if the ceasefire in Lebanon collapses, an Iranian response might not be directed at Israel itself, but rather at its closest Gulf partners, targeting economic interests and discouraging others from becoming involved. I emphasize that this remains a theory circulating in discussions, not an adopted plan. And according to the logic of Iran's previous behavior, before any action were taken, it would first give that partner an opportunity to step back. There are also two signals that I am watching closely because they indicate the direction of events. The first is Lebanon. The ceasefire there has existed largely on paper since mid-April. The South continues to experience airstrikes, and it is important to examine the situation calmly and without labels. The force that resisted along Israel's northern border for 2 years was not destroyed. It has rearmed and reorganized. New tactics have emerged, targeting commanders, reconnaissance drones, combat drones, and artillery working together to disrupt leadership structures. According to reports, a senior officer was seriously wounded in a direct drone strike. Air superiority remains on one side, but that does not automatically secure control on the ground. The deeper one attempts to push inward, the more expensive every step becomes. The result can be a victory that costs more than a defeat. The second signal is almost invisible, buried deep within a draft American defense bill. A provision calling for much deeper military integration with Israel has appeared. Joint production programs, expanded data sharing in advanced technologies. In words, it seems minor. In practice, it represents a shift of procurement and cooperation away from public traceable government channels into less transparent structures where the public can no longer easily see what is being transferred and where it is going. And this is happening precisely at a time when public confidence in that alliance is declining. The retreat into opacity is itself a sign that the previous model can no longer operate comfortably in full view. If we put everything together, a pattern emerges. The leverage of power is weakening. It can be seen in the drone losses, in the limited strikes followed by withdrawals, and in the fact that a 6-month demining effort is presented as though it could be solved by a single tweet. Economic leverage is weakening as well. Helium shortages, rising chip prices, dependence on heavy oil, government bonds being sold off, and markets that no longer trust official statements. Diplomatic leverage is also faltering. Positions fluctuate and often fail to survive until the moment of signature. The circle of allies is fraying. The Gulf is divided. Oman is distancing itself. Support structures have narrowed to a handful of bases. I discussed in the previous program what this kind of overstretch looks like in the context of Ukraine and the situation involving Cuba. Here I will simply repeat the conclusion. Resources are finite, and there are too many fronts. And all of it converges in the single day with which I began. In the morning, the blockade is lifted. By evening, military operations begin. That is the portrait of a power left with more words than means to support them. Where all this ultimately leads, I would not dare predict with a specific date or hour. But in my assessment, the direction is becoming increasingly clear. There will be no formal peace. One side continues to dictate terms consistently, while the other remains unable to commit itself. What remains is a suspended condition, neither war nor peace. A limited strike followed by withdrawal, a tweet followed by its contradiction before nightfall. And because words can no longer be fully trusted, I suggest watching two things that are harder to manipulate. First, the hardware. Not official statements, but whether tanker aircraft, fighter formations, and carrier groups actually begin leaving the region. So far, they have not been withdrawn. Second, the market. Not headlines about peace, but whether prices believe them. On the day with which I began, they did not. And that may be the most important thing to remember, because there is a particular paradox in what is happening. A power that became accustomed to moving markets and shaping destinies with a single statement is discovering that the statement is still being spoken, but it no longer moves anything. And the most dangerous moment in great power politics is not when the strong issue threats, but when they continue threatening out of habit without possessing the means to carry those threats out, and have not yet realized it themselves.